So we're going to kick off by having a look at the problem. So we're going to build a class which is describing a person, and later on we're going to put that in an address book. So if we have a look at the CRC card, or rather the class diagram card for this, this is kind of what I've come up with, okay, as part of my design process for working this out. So we've got a person class, and it's got a bunch of attributes, okay. It's got a first name, which is a string, surname, which is a string, date of birth, which is a string, emails, which is an array, and then phone numbers, which is an array. And then we've got a few methods here, which we want to be able to call on instances of this. There's full name, which should return a string. There's add email, which takes a string, which is the email address, and adds it to this emails array. And then we've got the same thing for add phone. And then we've got this print details method, which we want to return undefined, but the workshop will show you what that should do under the hood later on. And then down the bottom, I've got the constructor, which we want to take in a first name, which is a string, a surname, which is a string, and a date of birth, which is also a string. So the constructor takes in 3 arguments, all of which are strings. Now, this isn't quite all the requirements, because there is one additional requirement, which is that when we pass stuff into this constructor, if we don't capitalize the first letter of the first name, we want that to be capitalized when it's stored in this first name attribute here. So that's like another requirement that's like not described on here. But this is like a good starting point for working out how we're going to do this. And what I tend to do when we've got a problem like this is come up with like a vague plan for implementing this. And I often just write this in the README. So I'm like, what stuff do we need to do here? So for me, we want to start off probably by just doing the constructor. So that's like basic stuff. We want to do the constructor, and then we want to check that it worked. And then, because we're kind of dealing with constructor-y stuff, maybe we want to look at capitalizing that first name. So that's that other requirement which we've worked out, right? We want to capitalize first name when it's passed into the constructor. And then the third thing we want to do is implement this full name function. So we'll worry about how to do that when we get to it. And then finally, we want to implement this emails thing. Okay, so we want to add this emails attribute, and we also want to add this add email method. So emails and add email. Cool. And the other stuff we'll leave for now. We'll come back to that and add to our plan when we get a little bit further on. So if we have a look at this first thing here, right, we need to implement a person class, and then we need to implement the constructor, which is described on our card. So we're going to start off by creating a test for that because we're doing TDD. So I'm just going to come over here and make a new file called person.test.javascript. And this is going to be our test for the person class. It's kind of usual when you're doing this stuff to name these files after the class that we're dealing with. So if our class is called person, the test should be called person.test.js, and the actual model, the class, should be called person.js. And then in here, we need to do some stuff. We need to bring in chai, and we need to kind of set up our person, right? So I'm going to start off by just bringing in chai. And then I'm just going to set up another thing called expect. This is what we saw yesterday. This just means that we don't have to call chai.expect everywhere. We can just call expect. And then we're going to kind of describe our person thing. So we're going to get a describe block. And I'm using ES6 arrow functions here just to make it a bit easier. So this is kind of where we're going to describe how we want it to work. And this is the point at which we should start actually thinking about, like, how do we want to design this thing? So we want a test for this first bit over here, this constructor. So we can write a test for that, saying something like it should initialize properly. And then in here, we need to start thinking, like, how do you want this to work? And I think for now, I want to basically be able to create a new person, and we'll stick it in a variable called person. And we know already that we want it to be able to take 3 parameters. Okay, if we have a look at this, we can see it needs to take a first name, a surname, and a date of birth, all of which are strings. So we can kind of simulate that. So we just make someone up like Joe Blogs, and let's pass in, I don't know, 1st of Jan 1990 as the date of birth. So that's kind of, this is how we want this bit to work. It should be a capital, right? And then when you think about like what stuff should it return? So if we've created this correctly, we should be able to now say person dot first name, and we should be able to get back like their first name, which is going to be Joe in this case. So we need to turn this into an expectation. So we can use Chai's syntax to say that we expect person.firstname to equal Joe. So that kind of makes sense, right? We're setting up this thing using constructor, and then we expect to be able to look at the first name attribute, and that'll be set to Joe. And then we expect to be able to do the same thing with surname, but we expect that to be Blogs. And then we expect to be able to do the same thing with date of birth, and we expect that to be 1st of Jan 1990. And that should probably do for now. Like that's enough setup stuff. This checks the constructor works properly, and it checks that we can call these attributes and they've been set properly by that constructor. So if we run that test, we get some failures, which makes sense. Person is not defined. So we need to come up here and define our person. And we're going to require this in from another file, which we haven't created yet. So we want to require this person in from the models folder, and we want it to be called person.js. And now if I run these tests, we'll get an error. And it's a big ugly error, but at the top it says cannot find models person.js. Oh, person.js, let's fix that. Cool. And that's because we haven't created the file yet. So it makes sense that it can't find this person.js. So if we head over here and we actually create a file in here called person.js, hopefully when we run the test now, it'll find the file, but we'll get a different error back saying person is not a constructor, which makes sense. So we need to create that. And then we need to export it. And hopefully if we run the test now, we get another error, assertion error, expected undefined to equal Joe. And that's because the constructor, we don't have a constructor yet, so it doesn't set things up properly. So we need to make a constructor. So we can do that with the keyword constructor. And we know that we want this to take 3 things. Okay, it's going to take a first name, a surname, and a date of birth. And then what we want to do in here is we want to assign each of these to a property on the current object. And we can get the current object with this. So if we say this.firstname equals first name, and then if we just duplicate that a couple of times and then do the same for surname and date of birth. Hopefully, if we run these tests, we've got an error. First name is not defined. Cool. That's the test catching an error in my typing. Should be first name with capital N. And there we are. We've got a working test. So that's the first bit of our requirements done, right? We've written a test which describes the constructor and then checks that we can access the right stuff. So the next thing that we need to look at is capitalizing the first name from that requirement. So what we want to happen is that if we pass in like a lowercase letter here, we want it to capitalize it when it assigns it to this attribute inside the object. So I feel like we should write another test for this, okay? So I'm just going to copy and paste this test down here, and I'm going to change the name to say it should capitalize the first name. And then we want to create a new person in exactly the same way as we did before, but this time we're going to not capitalize the first name. So we'll have like Amy Nother. And what we expect to come back is that the first name has been capitalized. So we don't care about these. We don't care about testing that the surname, anything about surname or anything about date of birth. We just care about this turning Amy with a lowercase a into Amy with an uppercase A when it's stored. So this is like a really small little test that tests this particular bit of functionality. And if we run the test now, we get a failing test, right? We actually got back Amy with a lowercase, and we wanted to get back Amy with an uppercase. So how do we deal with this in our implementation? Well, we know that we want to do something here because we're getting in Amy with a lowercase a here in this first name, and then before we assign it to the property, to the attribute of this object, we want to capitalize it. So we want to do something here like, I don't know, capitalize. We want to do something like this, right? So that it capitalizes that, whatever that string is, before it puts it in first name. How do we capitalize stuff in JavaScript? Well, I had no idea. How did I find that out? I Googled it. And it turns out that the easiest way to do it, which is not particularly easy, is like this. So all that's happening here is we're taking the first name, we're getting the first character from it, and we're turning that to uppercase. And then we're adding that string to the first name, and this slice thing basically chops off the first character. So like if you want to see how that works, I can jump into a console here, right? And if we've got a string like Danny, and we call .slice with a 1, it'll chop off the first letter. And if we call char at 0, that'll get the character at the 0 position, which is just going to be a D. And so we can call on that to uppercase, which capitalizes it. And kind of by joining these two things together, like this bit and this bit, we get a string with a capitalized name. So now we got that in, let's check, see if we've broken anything. Ooh. And we haven't. So we haven't broken the initialize thing. We haven't broken that first test. That's still working. And now we have another test, which is checking for that capitalization thing. Cool. So we've checked off these first two things in here, which is kind of cool. What we need to do now is look at this full name method. So what we want this to do, we want to be able to call a method called full name and have that return like the full name of the person. So either Joe Bloggs or Amy Nother. So we should write a test for that. It should return a full name. And then we want to create a person in the same way as we did before. Let's pick Joe Bloggs for now. So we're just going to create a person object for this test. And then what we want to do is we want to check. We want to say we basically want to be able to call person dot full name and have that return like Joe Bloggs for us. So we need to turn this into an assertion, which we can do in the same way we've come to expect from here. So we want to expect person.fullname to equal this string here. So what do we think is going to happen if we run this? Think about it for a second. What's person.fullname going to return at the moment? Is it going to return anything? Let's have a look. So we've got a pretty sensible error, right? Person.fullname is not a function, which is not because we haven't defined it. If we come over to our person.js, there's no full name function. So to fix this, we need to define it. And what we want this to do, we want it to return the first name plus a space plus the second name. So we could try doing, okay, first this dot first name, which will get us the first name plus a space plus this dot surname. Let's see if this works. Cool. Expected undefined to equal Joe Blogs. So you're probably shouting at me now, like what's going on here? It's because we haven't actually returned anything from this function. So we need to put return in here. And now if we try running the tests, we've got a green test. Awesome. So looks like we're good for this. We've ticked off another bit of what we need to do. So the last thing we need to do is deal with this emails thing. So what we want to be able to do, we want to be able to call person.emails and get back an array of all of their different email addresses, because people can have more than one email address. And in order to add emails, we want to implement a method called add email, which takes a string, and we want that to add the email to the array of emails. So the first thing we probably want to do is come and set up that emails attribute. So I'm just going to come up to this initialize test that we've already written, and I want to check that when we create a new person, by default we can call person.emails and it will give us an empty array because they don't have any emails yet. So we can do that with another expectation. Expect person.emails to deep equal an empty array. I'm using deep here because we're comparing arrays, and we kind of just need to do that. So if I run these now, we'll get a failure because we expected this array, and actually calling .emails returns undefined because we haven't got a property for that. So we want to fix that. Head over to here and set up this .emails. But because we're not passing anything in from the constructor here, we actually just want to always set this to an empty array that we can put our emails in later on. So we can just set this to a plain empty array. And that's going to mean whenever we create a new person, it's going to get the first name, surname, and date of birth from the stuff we passed into the constructor. But the emails is just always going to be set as an empty array. And hopefully if we run the tests, we get a green test again. And this is kind of worth thinking about here, that just because we've written a test doesn't mean that we shouldn't go back later as we get more requirements and start adding more stuff to our classes and change that test that we've already written. It's totally fine to do that. That's just the part of the process of building out software. So the last thing that we're looking at then, we've kind of done this bit, this emails attribute, but we want to have this add emails method, and that needs to take a string and it needs to then add that string to the emails array. So we need to write a test for that. So we can say it should accept new emails and add them to the array. And then inside here, we've got to create a new person, just like we did before. And now we need to kind of design how do we want this to work, right? So we want to be able to call person.addEmail. And we want to be able to pass in a string to this. So let's just pick some emails for Joe Blogs here. Maybe joe@example.com. And then just to be doubly sure this like works with multiple emails, I'm just going to add a second email. So maybe like joe.blogs at like workexample.com. And then what we want to do is we want to have an assertion here which checks that having done this and run this add email method a couple of times, when we call person.emails, we get back an array which has got these two emails in it. So we want to get back an array that kind of looks like this. Yeah. So we need to just wrap that up in an assertion. So we're just saying we expect when we call person.emails, now that we've done this stuff, to be deeply equal to this array here. Okay. So let's try running that. And we get a failure. Person.addEmail is not a function, which is what we expect. So let's go ahead and add that. So there's the function. That'll get rid of this problem for us. And now we've got a new problem, which is that we're getting back an empty array rather than the array we expected, which was having these two emails in it. And that's because we haven't really done much in here at all. So we need to change this so that we actually add whatever email is passed in here. So whatever gets passed in, we need to add it into this array here. So how do we add stuff to an array? We can do that with push. And we need to push in the email that's been passed in. So when this runs, what it's going to do is take an email in here, and it's then going to push that email into the array. Okay, because this .email is going to return that emails array. And hopefully when we run the test now, we've got green tests. So the last thing that we might want to do here is go and look to do a bit of refactoring. Looking at this, I kind of don't think there's any obvious refactoring that we need to do. Maybe we want to pull this thing out into a function or something. But I think for me, this isn't too complicated. So this is probably cool as it is. There's a little bit of refactoring we could do with a test, but we're not going to do that yet. We're going to save that for some other time. One of the things I want to highlight though, look how much code we've got in our person class, like 18 lines. It's not loads. And then look how much code we've got in our tests, like 40 lines. And this is quite normal, right? To end up with a lot more test code than you have production code, because the tests are necessarily more verbose. They've got a whole bunch of real life details in them. And there is some stuff we can do to tidy this up. But like, if you find yourself feeling like you're writing a lot of tests, or a lot of test code compared to the amount of production code you're writing, that's fine, because writing unit tests is part of writing good code in general. Cool.